Welcome everyone to this morning's Law Matters seminar on the role of law in coastal wetland restoration. It's fantastic to see so many people here. For those of you wondering who I am, that's quite understandable. I'm not very famous. I'm Rick Bigwood, the head of school at TC Byrne School of Law at UQ. So I'm also a well-known frequenter of breakfasts, free breakfasts in and around the Brisbane CBD. So you saw me here first. Anyway, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and their custodianship of the unceded land upon which we meet this morning. These are the people of the Yagara and Turrbal nations, both of Meanjin, which we now call Brisbane. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and extend the same respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples present here this morning. I acknowledge the contemporary Queensland First Nations community who continue to maintain their own culture, identity and Indigenous rights. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. Now, we're here today as part of the Law Matters series, which is run by the TC Byrne School of Law. The purpose of the series is to showcase world-leading researchers in collaboration with guest speakers from industry, the academy and the legal profession on important topics in law and social policy. Topics discussed in 2022 have included Indigenous rights, disability rights, defence technology and deaths in custody. Although this is our final Law Matters seminar for 2022, we hope to announce shortly some exciting events for next year, so please keep an eye out for those. We're lucky to be joined today over breakfast by an interdisciplinary panel of coastal restoration experts as they consider how and why law matters as we move forward with repairing the vitally important coastal wetland habitats in Australia and across the globe. Our panel will share their insights on how ecosystem services are being integrated into law and policy today. This includes the important balancing act between the long-term need to safeguard and leave space for coastal wetlands and the ever-present need for immediate land use in many economic contexts. Let me introduce our presenters to you. There'll be time after the presentation for questions and answers. In the middle, we have my colleague, Dr. Justine Bell James. She's an associate professor at the TC Byrne School of Law at UQ. She's an expert in coastal and marine environmental law and currently leads an ARC discovery grant examining how to integrate the ecosystem services of coastal wetlands into legal and policy frameworks. She has led research projects on blue carbon and provided consultancy service to the Federal Clean Energy Regulator during the development of the blue carbon methodology. She is currently engaged as the legal expert on several multidisciplinary projects examining future opportunities for coastal and marine restoration. At the far end, we have Catherine Lovelock, who's a professor at the University of Queensland. She's an ARC Laureate Fellow and Fellow of the Australian Academy of Sciences. Her research focuses on climate change and its impacts on coastal plant communities, as well as the role of coastal wetlands adaptation and climate change mitigation, or blue carbon. She leads projects in Australia and internationally to enhance restoration of mangroves and other coastal wetlands for climate change mitigation, adaptation and other benefits. She was lead author of the 2019 IPCC guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventories for wetlands and led the development of Australia's first blue carbon method for the voluntary carbon market. Our final panelist, Dr. Nicole Shumway, is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Centre for Policy Futures at UQ. Nikki is an applied marine conservation biologist, and her research seeks to understand how conservation outcomes can be improved by interfacing science with policy using novel approaches and decision support tools. She is currently part of the regulatory sub-program in the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program, where she explores the policy implications of innovative marine restoration and adaptation practices in the Great Barrier Reef. So I now invite our panelists.
May I also just start by acknowledging the traditional owners of Meanjin, where we meet the Yagara and Turrbal people, and pay my deepest respects to their ancestors and descendants. And as we talk today about the really important business of environmental restoration, I think it's really important to acknowledge the tens of thousands of years experience that our First Nations peoples have in managing the lands and waters of Australia. And I really hope that we can continue to draw upon that wisdom as we move forward with restoration. So coastal restoration, as I'm sure a lot of you in the room know, is rapidly gaining traction both here in Australia and also worldwide. So what we're going to look at today is coastal restoration really through the lens of law and look at what has been achieved to date, but also what still is yet to come, and the pivotal role that the law has played and will also continue to play as we move forward with restoration. And law has played a really crucial role in removing some of the big barriers to undertaking restoration, but it will also continue to play a role in the big future barriers that we still have to look at. All right, so coastal wetlands, for those of you that aren't familiar with them, and I know there's certainly people in the room that know an awful lot more about them than I do, they provide a host of critically important ecosystem services that are really crucial to human existence. So this includes things like fisheries value, so the tangled mangrove roots are the perfect habitat for little fish to grow in before they can go out and be big fish. They filter and purify the water. They're a timber and fuel source across a lot of the world. They play a really important role in sequestering carbon, which we'll talk a bit more about today, and they can absorb carbon both in their biomass and their soils. And the coastal protection function of coastal wetlands is really important as well. So they help to stabilise shorelines and protect coastal communities from wave energy and from erosion. But there's been a historic undervaluing of these ecosystems across the world, and there's been a really high proportion of coastal wetlands lost globally over the past century or so. And that's really related to this history of them being undervalued and the fact that they occupy a really vulnerable and contested part of the landscape in the intertidal zones. There's been a history of them being cleared for development, for economic development, for agriculture. So we do have this history of loss that we need to contend with. But they're also still vulnerable to loss, to development, to agriculture, to, of course, climate change. So as we're moving forward, we need to be thinking about the future. We need to be thinking about forward-looking protection of these ecosystems. But we also need to be looking backward and thinking about restoring and making good this legacy of harm that we have to contend with. Now, coastal marine restoration has been perhaps slower to take off than terrestrial or land-based restoration. And there's a number of reasons for that. And part of it is the science. It's just taken a bit longer and it's come behind some of the science in the terrestrial zone. And Kath will talk a little bit today about how they overcame some of these hurdles in the context of wood carbon. There's difficulties of working in a marine environment. If you think about the water, it's subject to currents and waves, and things can happen in locations that you wouldn't necessarily expect as compared to what happens on land. So that's something that you need to contend with. Money, these projects can be expensive, and there has to be a recognition that we might need to pay a lot for restoration projects at the beginning to get some pilot projects underway and learn from them before things can become more cost effective. But there's also some really big legal barriers that we've had to think about and we'll have to continue to think about moving forward. This includes land tenure. So I already mentioned the fact that these ecosystems exist within that contested intertidal zone, and it's not always going to be clear whether something's located on public or private land and where it will be located once a restoration project is underway, which in turn then has ramifications for things like ownership of carbon, but also liabilities if the project is going to have ramifications on landfall, for example. There's a lack of overarching legislative goals and objectives in a lot of places for restoration, and there's also a lack of dedicated and fit-for-purpose permitting processes for a lot of restoration projects, which means that if somebody wants to undertake a project, they often need to engage with the development assessment system, which really isn't designed for that particular purpose. So there are some barriers to overcome, but the time is really ripe to overcome these. So we are towards the beginning of the UN decade on ecosystem restorations. That's from 2021 to 2030. And in the wetland context, I think some of these barriers are really starting to fall. And we're really on the precipice of coastal wetland restoration taking off at a pretty great scale. And law has played and will continue to play a really, really critical role in this. So I'd like to just hand over to Kath, and she's going to talk a little bit about the types of interventions and the types of restoration projects that you might do in the coastal environment.
So I want to talk mainly about projects that actually influence the hydrology of land, and that's going to come clear in a moment when we start talking about the blue carbon method. But some of these are, I've got an example there. The first figure is Indonesian fishermen restoring unproductive shrimp ponds. So a lot of the destruction of mangroves throughout Southeast Asia, and in fact throughout the world, is due to their conversion for shrimp aquaculture, which of course generates foreign exchange in those countries. And one might argue that Vietnam's development came off the back of a huge expansion of their aquaculture in the Mekong Delta. Aquaculture is prone to disease, reductions in water quality and other things. So there's actually quite an opportunity throughout Southeast Asia to restore unproductive shrimp ponds back to something that becomes useful for harvesting of harvesting of different kind of fisheries products, for example, crabs, shellfish and other things, as well as timber and other resources, while providing protection and in some coastal protection, and in some cases where those projects can use the new emerging carbon markets to also generate income from carbon credits, right? So it's this sort of joined up vision of restoration and what it provides that's driving a lot of action throughout Southeast Asia. So more locally, I think I'm not certain whether anybody's aware of the Blue Heart project. So this is in the heart of the Sunshine Coast, which is why it's called the Blue Heart. It's a proposed 5,000 hectare restoration that's been done by the Sunshine Coast Council in collaboration with Unity Water, so a water utility that's interested in offsetting their nutrient business, right? So wetlands absorb and process nutrients. And then, of course, the City Council is into it for flood control because this is on the Maroochy floodplain, right? The local Indigenous people are into it because this is restoring cultural heritage. The Maroochy is very important, right? And then, finally, we're also interested in biodiversity and tourism opportunities. So the Blue Heart is a sort of wonderful example of multiple stakeholders achieving their goals, right? So the Blue Heart also has a preliminary blue carbon project that's funded by the federal government to sort of pilot blue carbon credit business for the City Council, or Sunshine Coast Council. And finally, I suppose my other, we'll talk about Bulimba Creek. It's another Brisbane example. This is a restoration, a small one, but it occurred in conjunction with a large infrastructure development, which was the port, the road to the port. So they restored an oxbow, which is one of those circular sort of lakes that had been disconnected from the river and was basically a stinking, fetid mess. And they reconverted it into a functioning mangrove ecosystem, right, with other, salt marsh and other things. So this was very optimistic. It's very small. I think about that, and I raised that one just because I was talking to some other people this morning about the Olympics coming and more infrastructure and the opportunities we might have in there if it's possible to do restoration. And then finally, the last example is Adelaide, where if you know Adelaide, it's a very arid environment, and there's salt ponds that have been built on that have huge salt pond development around the outskirts of Adelaide, which are now some of them being reconnected for carbon sequestration and for biodiversity, particularly birds. Right? So there's a lot of examples there. People trying to achieve different things. In restoration, it's really important to identify what you're trying to do, and a range of examples that I hope sort of illuminate what we're trying to do here. And a lot of them are about reconnecting the tides, changing land use, and that's, I suppose, the segue back to the law.
Yeah, thanks, Kat. So that leads us into the blue carbon methodology, which we've mentioned this morning, and some of you might not be so familiar with. So it's a really recent triumph, I think, in the coastal restoration space. And it is a legislative instrument at the federal level that came into force in January this year. And myself and Kath and a number of other scientists and academics and practitioners from across Australia played a part in this over quite a number of years. So it was quite a lengthy process, and there were a lot of barriers that had to be overcome, science, technical and legal. But the experience shows us these barriers can be overcome. So just starting from the beginning, those of you that aren't too familiar with our emissions reduction fund, which has been the dominant climate change response under the previous Liberal government, it is something that rose from the ashes of the previous Labor government's carbon farming initiative. So it was all carrot, not a whole lot of stick. But if people, owners wanted to do sort of projects that would generate carbon abatement, then they could engage with the emissions reduction fund, get Australian carbon credit units once the abatement was generated, and those units could then be sold back to the government through an auction scheme, or they could be traded on the voluntary market. So to engage with the emissions reduction fund, the first thing a prospective proponent would need to do is apply to the Clean Energy Regulator for accreditation as an eligible offsets project. And the very first thing that you would need to do in order to do that would be show that your proposed project fits within a method that has been created as a legislative instrument at the federal level. So there's a few dozen methodologies for all sorts of different activities that generate carbon abatement. But until this year, there was nothing to cover restoration of coastal wetlands or blue carbon being the carbon sequestered by these marine ecosystems. So nothing until this year. The other things that you would need to demonstrate to show that you have an eligible offsets project that raise particular challenges in the marine context, identifying an offset site, showing that you have a legal right to carry out the project, demonstrating additionality. So that's a key part of the carbon market, that what you are doing is additional to what would have occurred in the absence of this project. And also permanence, which for those of you familiar again with the carbon market doesn't necessarily mean what you think it would. It means either 25 or 100 years, depending on how it's defined. So each of these elements can be quite challenging in the coastal zone. So it's often difficult to identify exactly where an offset site is in these fluid three-dimensional environments. The intertidal zone boundary, as I mentioned before, is often not well defined, and it's difficult to determine whether wetlands are located on public or private land. Therefore, a legal right to occupy land to carry out a project might not be so easy to find. Certain types of restoration activities, like Kath mentioned, the more passive ones of removing barriers that improves water quality, might sometimes make proving additionality a bit complicated. And a lot of these structures were also constructed either without or was required, which is a bit of a concern to some governments in terms of proving additionality. And permanence is something that can be impacted in the coastal zone, particularly when we're dealing with climate change and rising sea levels. So these were all things that we had to think about in developing the blue carbon method. But once a project, any sort of project, has been accredited as an eligible offsets project under the ERF, then they can be issued with Australian carbon credit units, which, as I mentioned, can then be sold through the reverse auction process held by the Clean Energy Regulator. I'm not too sure what is going to happen with this particular scheme under the Labor government, but certainly the underlying machinery of the ERF will subsist and might in fact play a much more important role depending on what happens with the review of the safeguard mechanism that's underway at the moment. Or of course they can be sold on the voluntary market. So whenever you take a flight and click, yes, I want to offset my carbon emissions from this flight, that is engaging the voluntary carbon market. All right, so coming to blue carbon in the ERF, and I'm going to hand back to Kath to talk a bit about the types of projects that were considered and why we landed on this particular type.
So the development of the blue carbon method was really strongly government-led. And one of the first, we had a series of workshops that, talked about what stakeholders wanted, what the scientists knew, what people's aspirations were in this space. And when we talked about different activities that might be included in the method, it was really settled upon, which was the removal of tidal or the removal or modification of barriers to tidal flows. And the reason why that was chosen is, one, it's clearly additional. You did something and then you got a result. And if you didn't do it, you wouldn't have got it, right? As Justine said. And then the other thing, it was considered that this probably had the largest opportunity on the landscape. And that's because coastal wetlands, broadly defined, not just mangroves, but particularly salt marshes and supratidal forests, things like Melaleuca and all of these sort of adjacent brackish wetlands at the back of the site, had been converted over the years to agriculture. So one of the big uses in Queensland is actually ponded pastures, and there's a picture here. Basically, you cut off the tide, you flood with fresh water from the back, and you're making pasture for cattle. So this is a huge land use in North Queensland, covers more than 50,000 hectares or more in the coastal zone. It's prominent, particularly the sort of more arid or seasonal rainfall parts of Queensland, right? And it's a way of generating, it's a way of finishing cattle in the dry season because you maintain this wet area. Unfortunately, they were also planted with weeds. So we have a whole bunch of declared weeds in those habitats as well. Okay, so the other one is drainage schemes. So throughout Australia, all states, there's possibly without the exception of the Northern Territory, there's drainage schemes. And in Queensland, they were particularly made for sugarcane. So we drained the floodplain, put in drains and tidal gates that prevent the incursion of tidal water into the drains, but allow, they're one way. You can see in this picture, this big flap gate. So if the water's in there for rainfall, it drains out, but the tide, as it comes in, it pushes the gate closed. So those two land uses were particularly interesting. You know, one thing is, you know, the declining price of sugar is an issue here. So sort of like turning over industries might have been in the background of some people's thinking. And then also with sea level rise, these are very low level, you know, low elevation lands, that there might be opportunities for landholders to engage in some way for parts of their properties that might be more vulnerable to transition to a different kind of income stream, which might be farming carbon in the coastal zone. Oh, yeah, but I'll continue here. So the blue, you know, with all that, we had a whole, you know, the scientific working group was 13 strong members from all states. You know, it's really important that everybody, because the wetlands vary so much over Australia, that we had to have, you know, expertise from everywhere. This is the picture that appears in the simple method guide. You've got your tidal restriction mechanism. You would withdraw that or modify that, allow the tide in, re-establish the wetlands, which we don't really anticipate there'll be needs for planting, because coastal wetlands are amazing at reoccupying space once it becomes available. And both start the carbon sequestration in biomass and into soils, but also avoid emissions of methane, particularly nitrous oxide, that are coming off the current land use. So wet pastures emit methane, and wet areas that are fertilised definitely emit nitrous oxide. So projects can result in avoided emissions as well as enhanced carbon sequestration.
So how did we get over the legal issues in establishing the blue carbon method? So Kath talked about how additionality could be shown through that particular sort of project type, and it could also be shown from a legal perspective, because to remove one of these structures, like we've got here, you need to generally obtain some sort of permit, or sometimes a dozen permits depending on the jurisdiction, to do that. So the fact that you need to engage with that legal process shows that it is something additional and something that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Now, as I mentioned before, there was some concern because some structures might have been constructed without approval. In that case, the government would technically have the authority to order its removal. So how it was decided to get around that was to require the proponent to show proof that it was constructed lawfully, either through a development approval or through a notice from the relevant government agency stating that they deemed it to be something that was lawfully done. So tick, we got around that. A legal right to carry out the project. So on land, this can be quite simple. You either own the land or you obtain a legal right over somebody's land through a property-based covenant. But as I said, if we're really not too sure who owns what and who is going to own what once the tide comes in, it gets much more complicated. And it was decided that the best way to resolve this was really just the easiest way, which was resolving everything contractually. So getting the parties to agree contractually who had the legal right to carry out the project and who would have ownership of the wetlands and the carbon stored therein once they re-established, bearing in mind that it is something that is a financial commodity that can be sold and traded. Potential impacts on neighbours was something that we had to consider. So when you're reflooding land, you might not just flood the land you intend to, it might also flood into neighbouring properties, which they might not want. And then you're potentially looking at legal liability for things like negligence or nuisance. So again, that was something that we spent a lot of time thinking about, and the decision was that before undertaking a project, you'd need to undertake hydrological modelling, look at who's likely to be impacted, and then get the consent of those landholders prior to undertaking at some point in undertaking the project. So that's how they dealt with that. And permitting is still a tricky issue in undertaking restoration in Australia. As I said, we do not have in a lot of places dedicated permitting pathways for undertaking restoration, which Nikki will talk more about shortly. So what we did instead, with the help of my PhD student Rose here, is we looked at what permits you would need in all jurisdictions across Australia. So at least we had a guide as to where you had to go in order to get one of these projects underway. So the blue carbon method is an incredibly important development. I think it's a really wonderful thing that's happened this year. It gives a clear financial incentive to undertake restoration. So it's a really important conclusion, but it's also the start of a really important journey, which is moving forward with other types of projects and other sorts of ecosystem services focuses. So maybe not restoring something simply for carbon, maybe starting from the perspective of tourism or coastal protection. So we're really at a critical juncture at the moment in restoration. So there's still a lot to do in the scientific and the legal space as we move forward. And we perhaps need to tread a little bit carefully in the absence of an overarching legal framework with objectives as to what we should be doing across the landscape. So on that note, I'm going to pass to Nikki, and she's going to talk a bit about the experiences that we can learn from other jurisdictions, as well as other issues to be mindful of as we move forward.
Thanks, Justine. Okay, so keeping in mind the challenges that Justine just discussed, particularly around the blue carbon methodology and its development for the ERF, we found in general in the past, there are some bigger projects coming online, but that restoration in Australia is at a much smaller scale than what you sometimes see in so an example of this is the Living Shorelines project in the US. So this is administered by NOAA and the Army Corps of Engineers. And there's large scale projects across the coastal US, more than 200 projects. And then we have managed realignment in the UK and in the EU. So this is actually administered in the UK by the Department of Environment there, and there's more than 120 large-scale projects happening, and so this is intentional tidal flooding of low-lying flood-prone habitat into coastal areas for climate mitigation mostly. So we wanted to know what are the sort of regulatory enablers that are happening in these countries that we can learn from to better enable coastal restoration in Australia. So we found a few things. So in Australia, and I'm going to preface this by saying that permitting information is really difficult to find on the scale that you would need to say that, you know, it's a really comprehensive study. what we tried to do was really get a good feel for what was out there. But basically what we had to do was go to a very fine local scale project level. And in some cases, even talking to restoration practitioners about their permitting experience, which they were mostly so traumatized by that they were happy to discuss in detail. But what we found is that in Australia, large-scale restoration is occurring most commonly through the development permitting process. So this is the same kind of permitting process that you would need for infrastructure development, say. So it's really complex, involves multiple agencies, multiple permits. And so on the one hand, you have a high level of oversight, right? Which could be good for high-risk projects. But it's also time and resource intensive. So it really limits the scope and scale of what can be done effectively. So what we found in other countries is they use a lot of multi-agency agreements. This was particularly common in the US for some of their large-scale projects. So in Australia, Justine mentioned that you might have to have a dozen for oyster restoration. I think we found 15 different permits through 5 different agencies for a restoration project. So other countries use multi-agency agreements. So instead of multiple permits through multiple agencies, what they do is one permit coordinated by multiple agencies. They come together to do it. And you can see that this would be a little bit more effective in the time and resources need. And in some cases, projects were even exempt from permitting. So we saw this in Canada for fish habitat restoration, which obviously isn't ideal if it's a high-risk project, but there are countries out there doing it other ways, right? And so while we can't say that the permitting process really influences whether a restoration project is going to be successful or what that means long-term, what we can pretty well say is that a legislative process that allows restoration to occur with a net benefit purpose is likely to mean more coordinated and more effective restoration at a larger scale. So what can we learn? What we found, which was pretty clear, I think, regulatory oversight and the permit process in Australia is really complex. It's multi-jurisdictional, and it's really difficult for practitioners to navigate. So clear regulatory guidance would be helpful for restoration practitioners, but also joint permits across agencies to streamline the process. And we do this to some extent already. So Department of Environment and Science and the Marine Park Authority do have a joint permit process for approvals for the Great Barrier Reef, but extending this would definitely help restoration go forward. Fit for purpose legislation, and this is a big one. So marine conservation legislation really designed to prevent impacts, right, from happening in marine environments. It really wasn't intended to allow things to happen, even if those things have net environmental benefit for the environment. So what it means is that, restoration has to navigate the same sort of legislative framework as if you were doing a development or an infrastructure project. And so that really limits the scope and scale of what you can do, especially if you're talking a large scale project, like one that would be needed, maybe cross-jurisdictional, to mitigate large scale impacts like climate change. And so looking forward, using a risk management framework that's for net benefit purpose was one of the recommendations that we had. And then the last thing we found, zooming out to like a wider scale, was that some of the most successful restoration projects that we found globally were part of larger state and regional policies. So this is the case for managed realignment in the UK, where the projects were developed within non-statutory countrywide shoreline management planning. So this is in the way they're currently managing their coastal areas. By contrast, when we looked at regional management planning in Australia, restoration is mentioned, but it's really not effectively implementing restoration in any way. And Australia was also the only country we looked at that didn't have any sort of national coastal management planning framework in place to enable these sorts of restoration projects happening. And so then on top of those issues, and those are just around more traditional restoration methods, we also have a lot of new and novel techniques and new and novel technologies happening in restoration. So the science of restoration is advancing, and it's advancing a lot more quickly than our ability to do it. So this example photo that I put up is at the top, you can see is a single species restoration. That tends to be how we do coastal restoration or have done it in the past. Now we're moving into more multi-ecosystem restoration. So this is a combination of, in the photo, I think it's seagrass, oyster, and kelp restoration. So looking at the ecosystem as a whole and restoring it as a whole. And so if you think single species restoration is complex and ticks a lot of different regulatory boxes for one species, imagine having the permitting process you would need to sort of do multiple species. And then on top of that, we have new and novel technologies. So things like selective breeding for thermal and stress tolerance. In seagrass, they're looking at stress-resistant seagrasses, hybridization of species. All of these things are happening to some extent, maybe not in coastal ecosystems so much, but definitely in reef systems, which is where my focus and a lot of my research is in. But if it's not happening yet, it will be happening. And right now, the legislative frameworks in place are just not able to deal with these for a few reasons, which I'll talk about. So some of the challenges to these sort of new and novel restoration technologies are around uncertainty, particularly around like novel risks and impacts relative to the benefits. We're sort of in this chicken and the egg conundrum where we need to do things in water to see what happens, but you can't actually get the permits to do them in water to see what happens because we don't know what the risks are relative to the benefits. They're missing framework. So a lot of the things, particularly around genetics and engineering and genetic modification, have been done in other aspects of ecosystems, so in crops and things like that, but haven't really been done for environmental benefit purposes. And that's also a whole different discussion about the values that we get from systems and what we're regulating them for and what we want the future of ecosystems to look like. Pacing problems. So the technology is advancing way more quickly than our ability to regulate it. So, if you regulate it too soon, then you're really putting a limiter on it. If you don't regulate it, then there's a risk of harm. And so it's a bit of a balancing act. It's multi-sector. So a lot of times people might need to engage with actors that they wouldn't necessarily engage with otherwise. So maybe environmental scientists need to engage with the Office of the Gene Technology Regulator. So it's pushing the boundary of what we're used to now compared to the sort of permitting that will need to be done into the future. And expertise is another issue. So they're often embedded in projects, and a lot of these things are at the leading edge of restoration. And so there might only be one person in the world knowing how these projects work, and the risks, and they're embedded in the project, right? So regulating that, when, is difficult. So the challenges around the sort of futures of regulations that we're looking at and the future of ecosystems that we're looking at really mean that traditional restoration and top-down regulation, like the sort of set it and forget it sort of laws, just aren't really effective at regulating these sorts of activities. And so developing frameworks that can deal with these challenges, that allow experimentation and take values of stakeholders into consideration, is really important. And I think going forward, it will really challenge the static nature of legislation as we know it.
Thanks, Vicky. So just summing up on everything that we've covered today, coastal ecosystems are critically important, and there's a lot of progress needed to restore them because of the history of degradation and loss that we have to contend with. And the blue carbon method is a really critical step towards getting this restoration happening and happening at scale. And the law played a really important role in getting the method up and running. There were some serious legal hurdles that had to be overcome, and we found ways that they could in fact be overcome. But we still have a long way to go. So we don't have an overarching legal framework setting out objectives for coastal wetland restoration across the landscape. And in the absence of that, there is a risk that we'll be having lots of different projects trying to serve different purposes in an uncoordinated fashion. We need fit for purpose permitting frameworks to facilitate these projects and let them get up and running much faster. And we need to be adapting these law and permitting frameworks to be able to deal with new and emerging technologies as they arise. So laws perhaps need to be a little bit more agile and flexible than they have been in the past. So currently there are some aspects of the law that act as a barrier to restoration. So the absence of overarching objectives in the permitting processes. But law is also really central to restoration, and there are some big opportunities there, and restoration can't occur at scale unless the law comes along with it and finds a way to navigate these barriers. And if we want restoration to scale up in Australia, and we do, we need legislation and we need legislative amendments to help that. And the time is right. The time is now to be considering these issues. It really is a critically important time for restoration in terms of the science and the need to do these things, but also on the back of this enormous groundswell of enthusiasm and excitement for restoration that's happening at the moment. Thank you. And I'd like to call on, I think Grace is here now, Grace Maruki from Healthy Land and Water. So I've asked Grace if she'd just give us a brief industry perspective and make some remarks on what we've said today. So I can come up the front, Grace, or you can sit there. That's fine.
Apologies, I was late.
That's okay. Thank you, Grace.
No worries. Thank you very much. Grace Maruki, I'm the science manager for Healthy Land and Water. And for those that aren't familiar with what we do, we are a not-for-profit organization. Our jurisdiction is Southeast Queensland, and our main mandate is the management of natural capital for our region. We work closely with stakeholders, including the regulators, innovation, that means the universities, as well as communities. And it's been an absolute pleasure to actually hear a cross-section of some of the challenges and opportunities that we actually grapple with every day. I also want to recognize how closely we are working with regulators. I want to acknowledge Stephanie's presence, because we have been chatting about the multiplicity and the challenges we face as industry in actually just doing on-ground works, not just in restoration, but in general, the management of natural capital, because our focus is really ecosystem-based. We are looking at the holistic benefits that we get, not just as, a return on investment from restoring a wetland, but also what are the other additional benefits and what are the challenges? How do we navigate the layers and layers and layers? Right now, we are having COP15 in Montreal starting today, I believe. And we're really, hopeful that that's going to also bring a little bit of clarity in terms of, is there a hierarchy in how we navigate, the whole, the complexity around doing the good thing. Now, one of the comments that I really would like to make on behalf of industry is the question of scale, particularly from Southeast Queensland. When we look at not just demonstrating additionality, our patch of the world, one of the biggest challenges we face is the diversity of tenure, how many the types of rights and bundles of rights around any works that we have to deal with when we go on ground. That's one. The other one is, it sounds a bit a blur when we talk about leaving no one behind. Really making sure that we capture and take along the diversity of stakeholders that are involved in this work. So legislation is really, really critical in terms of leveling out that ground in terms of how we act and making sure it's more than regulation, but the implementation when the rubber hits the road. We've got so many stakeholders, the Indigenous people, industry, and the signals that have been set out after the announcement of the State of Environment, the sort of reforms that need to happen, the signals that have been sent to the markets, the signals that have been sent to not just regulation in terms of what they need to do to enable that to happen properly. But industry is talking about investing in environmental markets, blue carbon, that's the way to go. The science is fairly mature, but when it comes to sort of the rules of play, we think as industry, it's really important that we engage widely, and at the risk of sounding like, it's a sales pitch for organizations that are able to actually bring together collaborators and stakeholders such as Healthy Land and Water. I think that's going to be really important. So it's one thing to really navigate the legislation barriers and hurdles, but to also ensure that when it comes to implementation, that we are bringing in all the stakeholders that need to be at the table. Not sure I'm with Mark, who also is my colleague. Mark Ward is involved in delivery of on-ground projects, a lot of them in wetlands. Mark, would you like to say something about the day-to-day practical challenges that you're faced with in restoration of wetlands?
Sure. Thanks, Grace. I'm Mark Ward from Healthy Land and Water. On the spot, yeah.
Sorry, Mark.
I couldn't help, it seemed like a lot of people are thinking on the same way that we are. We tend to be scientists or engineers or collaborators, and we're certainly not legal experts. And to paint a small picture here, we have a stakeholder that we have been working with for about 6 months. They have a seawall that's crumbling into the ocean. That before they constructed the seawall, it used to be a big 50 metres of mangrove, something along those lines. The mangroves are all gone. They want to know what to do with this space. It will take them about 3 months, maybe 6 months at the outside, to plan and deliver a seawall reconstruction project. It's really, really simple. But if we want to remove that seawall and go about a combination of a nature-based approach using oysters, a little bit of rock work and mangrove restoration, that could take us 18 months, 2 years, maybe, to jump through. So I guess that's a small little thing that keeps me awake at 4 a.m. How the heck can we get this thing over the line? Even with this amazing attitude in Southeast Queensland now, with the Olympics not far away, and people realising that they have these corporate ESG responsibilities and profiles that they can add some value to. So I guess I'm a little bit hopeful today that we can join a few dots to say, here's how we might be able to approach this or facilitate these kinds of projects to get the outcomes that we all want to see.
Thanks, Mark, and apologies for putting you on the spot. I think we are not just cautious optimists. We are really optimistic about not just the games. And the other thing that I would like to throw into the works is the ESG. I think that when some of these things are put out for people who want to do good, it's quite easy. The line between doing good and greenwashing or ticking the box can be quite thin if it's not really managed well. And the reason I say this is because we've been in this field of restoration, not just for the purpose of restoration, but also the energy that comes with rewarding people for doing the right thing. You know, the whole conversation around environmental markets. We feel we are sort of at the at a juncture whereby this combination of scientists, regulators, and community, we can push sort of a bit hard and really lead from the heart in terms of leading people to do the right thing, particularly in the case of the potential that wetlands hold. We feel at Healthy Land and Water, we are pushing really hard and forging ahead in terms of we want to be a part of this journey. We want to remain close to innovation, but we also want to be able to champion for the stakeholders to actually not just continue to benefit from these ecosystem services that the wetlands provide, but to actually be rewarded in actually doing the right thing. And this is why we're really supportive in terms of what's the next iteration of Blue Carbon method going to deliver for our stakeholders. So I'll leave it there and really do welcome some conversation and probably a couple of questions, if you will. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Grace. We do have a few minutes for some questions of the panel, if anyone.
I won't use the microphone.
Oh, yeah, very good.
John Goodman from the Moreton Bay Foundation. Thank you, panelists and Healthy Land and Water speakers, for your excellent presentations. There is no plan for Moreton Bay. There is a regional plan called the South East Queensland Regional Plan, which barely mentions Moreton Bay, but it is structured in a way that it makes suggestions as to how the environment should be improved rather than imposing obligations. In contrast, the Chesapeake Bay Plan in the United States requires governments and other participants, other people in the area, to do certain actions with specific goals, and they are given a smack on the wrist, even the governments, if they don't achieve those goals. Do you see a need or a structure in Queensland for state or regional plans which impose greater requirements on particularly governments, but also developers and us, for the improvement of the environment? And if so, if there isn't such a structure, what are your suggestions, and do you think it would be a good idea? Thank you.
Question.
Oh, you go, John. Squarely in your bum.
I think part of it comes down to the projector's right in my ass, so I'm just trying to actually see you. It comes down to that issue we were talking about, that's the need to be thinking about these things at the landscape level. So I think that's part of it, having these overarching objectives. As to whether it should be done through binding legal obligations or leaving it up to the market, that's a tricky question. And I think we are moving in a way that these things are going to be left to the market to a large extent. But I really don't have a strong opinion either way. What do you think?
Oh, personally, I think we need a really strong plan. I'm all up for that. But I don't know how to go about that, right? So I think there should be. I think we should have the councils signed up, particularly because they are the ones that do the rubber on the road management of lands in many cases. So they need to be, I think, really engaged in this process. And of course, in Queensland, we're used to a strong state lead with the local councils and NRM, coming in and adhering to that like stronger vision of what the region should look like. I think we've got so many elements of it. I mean, I love the blue part. And the Gold Coast City Council is actually awesome at restoration, right? But they just don't talk about it that much, and they don't do it under a blue carbon banner or anything, right? So there's so many things that the councils are, like doing, great work, and it just seems that it needs to be sort of brought together.
Yeah.
And I don't think there'd be any impediment, well, maybe there is. That's me being overly optimistic, friends.
That would be my comment as well. I think in the absence of like a broader management structure for coast, it falls more on local, which is why you get this local sort of scattered implementation and not on the local scale. So yeah, all for better coastal management planning at a regional level, especially in areas, like Brisbane, in Moreton Bay, cities like marine parks.
It would be great if it was layered from the national government, like we had a national plan, and then each of the states did something that was sort of like consistent, but regionally specific, because we do accept that there's sort of different things happening in different states, and, like states want to be independent, but it would be great to have a statement at that really national level that could feed down through the layers of government that we have.
And that is what happens in the US. So for the Chesapeake Bay management plan, for example, like all the restoration activities happening in Tampa Bay and San Francisco Bay, they're all navigated under a national.
We have time for one more question if anyone has one.
From Department of Agriculture and Fisheries. I was just interested in the overview. Thank you for an excellent presentation, everybody. Just wanted to ask, have you, Just wanted to ask, have you, in your analysis of the permitting side of things, have you seen a standout state, for example, in terms of excellence in handling these projects? Has there been one state? I know we've talked about Queensland and Australia generally, but is there a lead, a model, if you like? I guess in tandem with John's comment about the way we can perhaps learn from or engage and discover how they did it.
Thanks for the question. To you and everybody else from government that's here today, I think that's, Grace talked about how we've got a lot of people that are on the same page here, and government really is part of that. I think we all have a lot of connections with governments at all levels that are really interested in dealing with this problem. So it's certainly not an us against them. It's we're all working towards the same thing, and we really appreciate you coming along today. In terms of the standout state, I don't think we've gotten too far into it for everything. Certainly when I looked at the removal of tidal barriers, they were all pretty tricky. Nikki and I are about to embark on a big project next year where we're actually going to be looking at this across a number of project types in a number of states. So we'd be really happy to keep you updated. I don't know if you have any thoughts on Oyster Reef. I think, again, they were all pretty
similar. I think Victoria does a slightly better job. With more of a single, like one-stop shop sort of permitting process. But again, I don't think it's as.
I would say if we're talking about policy though, South Australia wins, right? And South Australia has a blue carbon strategy. They engaged very high in state government and have talked about it. And now they're actually, you know what they're doing? They started it last week. They're actually activating the process to make a seagrass restoration ERF method. Mm-hmm. They convened a meeting of stakeholders 2 weeks ago, or whatever it was, and included, CSIRO and as much of the federal government that can come at the present time. But they, they are driving that agenda. They're sort of like, well, if the feds aren't going to do it, we're going to do it. And I think that's great. And then New South Wales also came out with the blue carbon strategy relatively recently as well. Mm-hmm. So, movements, at least in stating an intent, but they're not, of course, they don't force anybody to do anything, right?
But resolving permitting is one of the key priorities of the New South Wales Blue Carbon Strategy, and I think they've made it a goal to fix it in 12 to 18 months. from memory. So yeah, they're certainly looking at it again from quite a high level.
Thanks for that question. Look, I'll have to bring the formal proceedings to a close, but in doing so, I'd like to thank the panelists who've done real justice to the spirit of the Law Matters series and their presentations. Thank you again, Grace, for your industry perspective as well. Thank you. I see Bell Marketing Communication Events for your assistance in making all this happen. I know you have a lot of early morning starts, so thanks for that. And 4 o'clock, you should be up at 4. I mean, keeping you awake at 4, sun's up, actually, but sorry, I had to get that in because I was up at 4 worrying about this event. But look, thanks everyone for attending. It's great to see so many people at this event. It's a very important event for the school and for the university. We get to showcase the talent that we have at UQ. Can I invite everyone? There's still half an hour of networking opportunities, and imagine there's breakfast remaining outside as well. So please feel free to mill around, and you might engage with further discussion with our panelists. But good morning. Enjoy the remainder of your day. Thank you.